The worst of the cold came without warning, not with snow, nor with storms, nor with any signs a man could read in the clouds or in the wind. It came in silence. One moment the sky was grey and heavy, the next it turned black as slate, and the temperature fell 20 degrees in a single hour. It was the kind of cold that turned leather stiff and cracked, that snapped brittle branches from trees with sounds like gunfire, that killed a man not through violence but simply by making him sleep too long. That was the winter that took 5 men in the valley and spared only one. His name was Thomas Granger, and what saved him wasn't luck, nor wealth, nor proximity to help. What saved him was something nobody else had seen coming, a hidden trick passed down from a line of men who understood the wilderness in a way the rest had forgotten. And when the truth came out years later, people would say it was just superstition or old-world nonsense. But the records showed one thing plainly. When every other cabin in the valley froze over, his didn't. Thomas didn't come west with dreams of gold or glory. He came because he had nothing left east of the Mississippi. No family, no money, no favors left to call in. Just a rusted wagon, a single mule, and a deed to 160 acres of wind-swept prairie land at the foot of the Bitterroot Mountains, signed over to him by a distant cousin who hadn't lasted 2 seasons out here. That cousin had died with frostbite up to his knees, and no roof left on the cabin he'd tried to build. The letter that came with the deed was short, scrawled in a fevered hand. If you're desperate enough to take it, God help you. Build better than I did. That was all. The first thing Thomas learned about the land was that it didn't forgive mistakes. It punished them. Water froze in the pail 5 feet from the stove. Nails snapped in the cold. Horses panicked in the night, sensing wolves that never showed their faces. The wind never stopped, not really, and it carried with it the kind of chill that settled in bones and never left. But Thomas didn't complain. He kept his mouth shut, his head down, and he paid attention. He arrived in early October 1841, too late in the year to build a proper house, too early to risk waiting out winter in a tent. The previous owner's cabin was still there, barely, a skeleton of scorched timbers and warped planks blackened by some forgotten fire. The roof had collapsed, the windows were gone. Inside, the charred remains of furniture sat half sunken into dirt, and a pile of frozen ashes marked where someone had once burned everything they owned just to keep warm. Thomas didn't flinch. He set his shovel in the earth, cleared the debris, and started over. The valley had seen better men than him fail. Mountain-hardened men, trappers with years of experience, ranchers with whole families to help them, surveyors with government backing. Most left within a season or two. A few stayed long enough to bury kin. The land wasn't cursed. It was just honest. Cold didn't care how tough you were. It got into your blood, your lungs, your marrow. It waited. It didn't have to rush. But Thomas had something the others didn't. Not strength, not money, just a letter. It had come years earlier, tucked inside a Bible that had once belonged to his grandfather, an immigrant from the Carpathians. Thomas had read it only once, years ago, then forgot about it. But in the dark of that first mountain winter, as the wind howled through the unfinished walls of his shack and snow came through the gaps, he remembered. The letter was written in faded ink, a mix of broken English and another language he barely recognized. It was full of strange measurements, odd diagrams, and a line repeated 3 times. Heat does not rise, it stores. If you build it right, it stores. He dug the letter out that night and studied it by lantern light, breath fogging in the air. He didn't sleep. He sat on the floor in front of his stove, eyes moving over each curve of the drawings, each strange little note, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't technical writing. It was more like someone had tried to explain an instinct, like a man describing how to keep a fire alive in a storm. There were drawings of walls, circles around certain joints, notations about wood and stone and the way wind moved through cracks. But one thing was clear. Whoever had written it believed that a house could trap warmth, not just create it. That winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 40 below in December, and a 3-day blizzard in January buried fences and barns alike. Thomas's walls were thin, his floor was dirt. His firewood supply dwindled faster than he could replace it. He lost his mule before Christmas, found frozen stiff in its lean-to. The neighbors, a quarter-day's ride east, lost 2 sons to the cold when their chimney collapsed, and the snow came in before dawn. And yet, somehow, Thomas made it. He made it through not because his cabin was warm, but because he learned in that cold. He began testing the things in the letter, small changes, little experiments. He lined one wall with flat stones and stacked them behind the stove. He sealed the rafters with a strange mixture of clay and moss and ground limestone he dug from a creek bed 2 miles off. He cut trenches around the cabin's base and packed them with frozen earth and bark. When wind came in one side, he'd open a low vent on the other, not to let heat out, but to move it, to stir it, to stop it from escaping too fast. Every change he made bought him another degree, another hour, another inch of safety. When spring came, Thomas didn't celebrate. He built. He didn't take the wagon to town. He didn't waste money on better clothes or tools. He cut more timber. He shaped stones. He studied shadows, how they fell on the cabin, how the sun moved over the valley. He tracked the wind using lengths of twine and colored rags. His neighbors thought he was touched. One even joked that Thomas was building a church for the sun itself, but he ignored them. He had a plan now, not just for warmth, but for survival. By the second winter, his cabin was unrecognizable. The outer structure was log, but the gaps between had been filled with a triple layer of material. First bark, then clay mixed with sand and straw, and finally a ceiling layer of lime and crushed charcoal. Inside, the floor had been raised, no longer dirt, but thick planks over a crawl space filled with packed earth and stone. His fireplace had been torn down and rebuilt, massive, central with stone benches on either side and a chimney that zigzagged, trapping heat before it escaped. But the most unusual feature was invisible, a hidden channel that ran beneath the floor from the fireplace outward, lined with stone and packed with earth. When the fire burned, heat radiated down through the stones, warming the floor from below, and even hours after the flames died, that warmth remained. Visitors who came by in late autumn noticed it first. The air inside Thomas's cabin didn't sting your lungs. The floor didn't freeze under your boots. The walls didn't leak breath steam in the corners. It wasn't comfortable by any means. It was still the frontier, but it wasn't deadly. It was survivable. And in that valley, that meant everything. But not everyone believed it. When a man does something different, something that works, others get nervous. Some whispered that Thomas had made a deal, that he'd found a warm spring under his cabin, or dug some hidden root cellar with a stove inside. Others said it was lies, that no man could stay warm without cutting 10 cords of wood a month. But the truth came out the winter of 43. That was the year the wolves came down from the mountains early, driven by hunger. The year 4 cabins burned when chimneys cracked under pressure. The year 2 families froze waiting on a supply wagon that never arrived. That year men started showing up at Thomas Granger's door, not with accusations but with questions. And Thomas, who had once had nothing, became the only man who knew how to build warmth into wood and stone. By the time the third winter rolled in, Thomas Granger's name had started to drift beyond the valley like smoke on the wind, first to the scattered homesteads on the ridgelines, then to the traders who moved between settlements, and eventually to the mouths of men in mining towns and river posts who had never set foot in the Bitterroots. Not as a hero, not yet. More like a question wrapped in rumor. You hear about that fella who beat the freeze, built a cabin that breathes like an animal? And that wasn't far from the truth. Thomas wasn't chasing comfort. He wasn't even trying to make life easier. He was trying to beat death at its favorite game. The cold didn't knock once when it came. It simply entered and stayed. If you weren't prepared, it buried you quietly. That was the reality every man out here knew in his bones. And somehow, Thomas had found a way to slow it, to outmaneuver it, not with brute strength, but with a quiet knowledge that most had either forgotten or never learned. His system wasn't about adding heat. It was about controlling it, guiding it, holding it. By now, his cabin had become a living thing. Every wall, every stone, every board had a purpose. He'd rebuilt it 3 times in 2 years, tearing it down each spring, and redesigning based on what he'd learned through each winter. And it wasn't just structure anymore, it was function. For example, the venting system he devised was unlike anything other trappers or ranchers had seen. Most men blocked every crack they could find, thinking any draft was a threat. But Thomas had learned differently. He understood that stagnation killed warmth as quickly as escape. If warm air gathered near the ceiling and stayed there, it created layers of temperature, freezing at your feet, sweltering at your head, unbearable to live in. So he built small, adjustable vents high on the east wall and low on the west. In winter, he opened them just enough to pull cold air low across the fire's front, forcing heated air to circulate downward. In summer, the system reversed. He opened the upper vents wide, allowing rising heat to escape while cooler night air drifted in at floor level. This wasn't invention. It was observation, pattern, cause, and effect. But not everyone who came to see the cabin understood that. The first man to show up asking for help was a widow's son named Ezra Porter. He arrived in mid-October, hat in his hands, voice cracking from frostbite on his lips. His mother had taken sick in a drafty lean-to up by Silver Creek. Their stove had cracked, the tar paper roof leaked, and Ezra had heard, through 2 layers of rumor, that there was a man down valley who'd built a house that didn't freeze. Thomas didn't hesitate. He followed Ezra back up the ridge the next morning and assessed the structure like a doctor diagnosing a dying man. The roof was too low. The door faced north. The chimney was built with soft river rock that had already split in the cold, and the entire place sat in a depression that trapped night air like a basin. No amount of fire would save it, so Thomas tore it down, not out of cruelty but clarity. He helped Ezra drag what lumber they could salvage to a small rise 100 yards uphill. There, on drier ground with better sun, they built something new. It wasn't a full replication of Thomas's own cabin. It couldn't be. They didn't have the time or the materials, but they borrowed the principles. A central hearth with extended stone mass, south-facing windows for passive solar warmth, double-layered walls packed with dried grasses, bark, and clay, a venting system using hand-cut shutters. And when snow came in early November, Ezra's mother survived. That was the first proof. Word spread quickly after that, but with attention came suspicion. Some men didn't like that Thomas had found something they hadn't. In the frontier, pride killed more men than wolves. A trapper named Red Halloran scoffed at the design, said Thomas had just gotten lucky with weather, that any man could stay warm if he had time to play mason instead of hunting. Red was a brute, thick-bearded, red-eyed, one of those mountain men who looked carved from the same stone he used to build his chimney. He challenged Thomas to come see his real cabin, claimed it was warmer by half, without any of that eastern fuss work. Thomas went. He didn't gloat. He didn't argue. He just listened. Red's cabin was massive. 2 rooms, a proper loft, even an overhang on the front porch, but inside it felt colder than outside. The fire roared, but the air never held it. Drafts crawled up from the floorboards. Moisture ran down the walls like sweat. The chimney glowed hot near the firebox, but sucked every bit of warmth straight up and out. It was beautiful, but it was bleeding heat from every joint. Thomas said only one thing before leaving. "You built a stove. I built a home." That winter, Red's youngest son died of exposure, and after the thaw, Red asked Thomas to teach him. Still, Thomas didn't act like a teacher. He didn't charge money. He didn't give lectures. He handed people a shovel and said, "Start digging." That's how he did it, one pair of hands at a time. He'd walk a man's land, ask where the sun rose and where the water pooled. He'd ask which way the wind came in February. He'd study the trees, the slope, the shade. Then he'd say, "Here," and he'd draw a rough outline in the dirt. That was the blueprint, nothing more. The rest came in the doing. The trick, the so-called hidden frontier trick, wasn't a trick at all. It was a sequence, a logic, a mindset. And most important, it was about position. Position the fire at the heart, not the edge. Position the mass inside, not out. Position the house where nature helps, not hinders. Thomas kept notes, crude ones, on scraps of birch bark and lengths of pine board. He wasn't writing a book. He was tracking experiments. He tried different mixes of chinking, straw and dung, moss and ash, clay with lime. He recorded which combinations held up best in freeze-thaw cycles. He adjusted roof pitches by a few degrees, tracked snow load and melt runoff. He tried floor heights, door placements, window depths. And he didn't settle. Every winter brought new changes, new ideas. His cabin wasn't a monument. It was a lab. By year 4, the valley began to change. Cabins grew smaller, tighter, heavier. Stone benches appeared inside homes, where before there'd only been wood chairs. Chimneys thickened. South walls grew windows with hinged wooden covers. More and more families survived the winter without tragedy, and though few openly credited Thomas, everyone knew who had started it. But the cold wasn't done. In January of 1845, the Bitterroots saw the worst freeze in a generation. 2 blizzards hit back-to-back. Temperatures plunged to 60 below. Cattle froze standing up in pastures. Birds dropped from the sky mid-flight. Whole sections of pine forest snapped from the weight of ice. Roads vanished. Smoke hung low to the ground, unmoving, trapped in cold so dense it became its own kind of sky. And for 4 weeks, nobody left their cabins, not once. That was when Thomas's design met its real test. Neighbors in the Eastern Bend had followed his principles. Their chimneys held, their hearthstones warmed through the long nights. Children huddled on benches that radiated heat hours after the flames had gone out. No one froze. No one burned to death trying to feed a blaze that couldn't keep up. No one buried their children in snowdrifts. But one family had waited too long. The Coopers lived west of the ridge, near the river bend. They had always thought themselves self-reliant. Calvin Cooper had once said, "If I can't do it myself, it ain't worth doing." And he meant it. He'd built his cabin wide and airy, more like a ranch house from Missouri than a high country shelter. He'd laughed at Thomas's talk of hidden heat and airflow and thermal mass. "Heat's heat," he'd said. "Build a big enough fire. It'll find you." The fire found them all right. It found their dry pine walls, their open rafters, their drafty plank floor. It burned half the structure down before the snow put it out. And when Thomas reached them, 3 days after the second blizzard broke, he found only Calvin alive, sitting against a scorched log with his boots frozen to the ground and his family under a tarp. That day broke something in Thomas. He'd tried to give people the tools, but pride was a hard thing to fight, so he stopped waiting for them to ask. In the spring of 1845, Thomas began traveling from homestead to homestead, mapping each site, asking questions, offering sketches. He carried a heavy pack of notes and samples, scraps of lime chink, split boards, homemade louver vents. He became part builder, part evangelist, part mechanic. Not everyone listened, but many did, because they had seen now what happened when you built a house against the cold instead of with it. And through it all, Thomas kept rebuilding his own cabin. The fifth iteration had walls thicker than ever, layered logs 2 feet deep in places, with an interior skeleton of stone columns tied together with timber beams. The hearth was now a 3-ton structure sunk 2 feet into the floor and built on a dry stone base. The ceiling incorporated a vented shelf system that trapped warm air in pockets and slowly radiated it downward, and the crawl space below had been expanded into a shallow subfloor chamber lined with gravel and stone that held heat from the hidden flue beneath the firebox. Thomas didn't claim to have invented any of it. He said the ideas came from old letters, old lessons, old mistakes, but the result was undeniable. His cabin could go 6 hours without a fire and still stay above freezing. He used 1/3 the wood of his neighbors. He never lost a night to frostbite. And most telling of all, by 1846, no one in the valley built without consulting him first. The following year brought something no one had expected. Not a storm, not a disease, but a man. He came out of the north in a black coat dusted with road salt and the pale gray of travel-worn wool. His name was Elijah Mercer, a land agent from Helena, or so he said, though the way he studied the valley, with squinted eyes and a notepad always in hand, made folks wonder if he had other aims. He wasn't looking to settle. He asked too many questions for that. Instead, he talked about expansion, about railway lines, about mapping land titles and making official records. He asked about roads, water sources, the number of households, but most of all, he asked about one man, Thomas Granger. Thomas had no dealings with officials. He didn't sign papers. He never filed a land claim beyond the original deed. His name wasn't listed in any register or county record, yet everyone in the valley knew him, and that seemed to trouble Mercer more than anything else. What gives him the right, he asked a rancher named Blake, to dictate how men build their homes? Blake didn't answer. He just looked toward the south ridge where Thomas's cabin sat, thin smoke trailing into a winter-bright sky. Fella saved my boy's life last February. Built us a chimney that didn't collapse when the frost came hard. If that's dictating, I'll take more of it. But Mercer wasn't swayed by gratitude. He believed in standards, in surveys, in official blueprints approved by men with titles and stamps. What Thomas had done, teaching frontier families to build homes that defied conventional methods, looked to Mercer's mind like rebellion, an unregulated innovation, an outlier. So he rode up to Thomas's cabin himself. It was early spring. The thaw had only just begun. Ruts of mud gripped Mercer's horse to the ankles, and meltwater ran in slow streams down from the foothills. Thomas was out front, chopping wood not for fire, but for framing. Thin lengths of split pine he would use in another experiment involving airflow between wall layers. He looked up only briefly when Mercer arrived. "You Granger?" Mercer asked. "I am. You know who I am?" "No, but you're not local. And that coat wasn't made out here." Mercer dismounted, boots squelching in the mud. "You've been teaching things, building things, changing how folks construct their homes." Thomas kept splitting wood. "They asked. I answered." Mercer frowned. "There are codes. There are standards. Not out here there aren't," Thomas replied without looking up. "Out here there's cold, and there's death. Everything else is window dressing." The exchange ended without resolution. Mercer left frustrated, his notebook heavier than when he'd come, but no closer to halting Thomas's influence. That summer, Thomas built his 6th iteration. This time it wasn't for himself, it was for a family of 5, the Cullens, whose matriarch had lost 3 toes to frostbite the previous January. They had no money, no strong sons, and no chance of surviving another winter in the drafty shack they called home. Thomas didn't wait for them to ask. He showed up with tools, stone, timber, and a wheelbarrow full of supplies. The structure they built was smaller than his own, but better in one critical way. Everything Thomas had learned, tested, and proven went into it. The fireplace was recessed into a double wall, with a radiant stone arch that reflected heat into the living space. The roof used overlapping cedar shingles soaked in pine tar to prevent leaks and increase insulation. The foundation was raised with buried footings, flat stones set 3 feet deep to resist frost heave. A small, concealed channel beneath the hearth allowed air warmed by the fire to flow into the crawl space and slowly rise through the floorboards, creating a passive heating effect that stayed steady even as outside temperatures plunged. And the walls, those were the masterstroke. Instead of the traditional single-layer log wall, Thomas designed a 2-shell system. The outer wall was standard log construction, chinked tight and sealed with clay and ash. The inner wall, 2 feet inside, was built with flat split timbers, arranged vertically and daubed with a mud-straw-hair mixture that Morning Crow had once described to him in passing years earlier. Between the 2 walls, Thomas Thomas laid dried leaves, bark, and a thick layer of wool she had traded to him the previous fall. Air could not move in that cavity. Heat could not escape. Cold could not enter. It was a fortress against the elements, built not with money or technology, but with observation and care. By the time the snow fell again, the Cullens were not only safe but thriving. Their youngest child, who had nearly died the previous winter, spent that December learning to walk again, barefoot on floors that no longer turned to ice overnight. But success breeds attention, and attention brings danger. Mercer returned, this time with a second man, tall, thin, with a mustache too neat for a mountain town, and a demeanor that screamed clerk or bureaucrat. His name was Ellison, a civil engineer with the railroad. They didn't ask Thomas for advice. They demanded schematics. They wanted his notes, his measurements, his material sources. Thomas refused. "I don't own this knowledge," he said. "It's not for profit, it's for survival." But they wouldn't relent. They argued that with expansion westward, towns needed uniformity, that homes had to follow guidelines, that safety came from consistency, not creativity. Thomas looked at Ellison squarely. "You ever built a cabin where the wind finds the cracks before you do? You ever buried a child in the snow because your chimney gave out in a freeze? I have, and I've seen what works. I'll take proof over plans any day." Ellison left in silence. Mercer did not. He promised to return with writs, with men in coats who carried ink and authority. Thomas was unmoved. He returned to his work. That fall, an early snowstorm hit before the first full freeze. It dumped nearly 2 feet across the valley and collapsed 5 unfinished cabins that had followed standard railroad blueprints. One of them belonged to a newly arrived family from Illinois. They were not ready for mountain life. Their firewood was damp, their food half frozen in the cellar. When the walls gave way under the weight of snow, the mother and her 2 children nearly died of exposure before a neighbor found them. Thomas took them in, not out of charity but necessity. "I'd rather teach you once than bury you," he said as he led them into the warmth of his home. And so he taught again. Each winter brought new students, willing or not. A trapper whose cabin rotted from the base, a preacher whose church eaves let in frost, a ranch hand with hands too blistered to grip an axe. Each one learned not just how to build, but how to think. Because Thomas didn't hand out blueprints. He handed out principles. Don't build where water rests. Don't point your door into the wind. Heat is not a product, it's a process. You don't keep a cabin warm by fighting cold. You keep it warm by giving warmth a reason to stay. Those lessons dug deep. By 1848, the valley had transformed. Newcomers were welcomed with more than just a handshake. They were given guidance, a tour, a warning. Build like Granger, they'd say, or don't build at all. But the future was knocking. The railroad was coming. With it, roads, engineers, and prefab designs, and Thomas knew he couldn't stop it. So he did the only thing he could. He began carving his knowledge into permanence. Not in books or newspapers. They were too fragile, too far removed. He carved them into beams, into lintels, into hearthstones, into every structure he helped build. A notch here to mark airflow, a symbol there to indicate vent placement, a groove to suggest where heat should travel. He encoded the valley. His legacy wouldn't be words, it would be warmth. The railroad came in the spring of 1849, not with smoke and whistles at first, but with stakes and men with measuring poles, scratching lines into the earth that only they could read. The surveyors moved like ants across the ridgelines, whispering to themselves in technical language and pegging down futures that hadn't yet arrived. With them came a slow swell of change, freight wagons, lumber haulers, telegraph runners, and whispers of development. The valley, for a long time a forgotten crack, between the Rockies, was now on someone's map, and that meant the days of wild cabins and lone builders were numbered. Thomas Granger saw it coming. He didn't rail against it. He didn't mount some resistance or try to bar the roads. He simply worked faster. There were still too many families unprepared for what the next winter might bring, and he knew that once the train tracks reached within 10 miles of the valley, the men with plans would overtake the men with wisdom. So Thomas made his rounds, quietly, steadily, teaching, measuring, digging alongside tired fathers and worn-down sons. He didn't lecture. He handed you a stone and said, "Feel its warmth after an hour near fire, then bury it under your floor. That's where it does the most good." He built 6 cabins that year, not alone, never alone, but with men and women who now understood why a wall should be built with intent, not haste. Each cabin was different. The land dictated design, but the principles never changed. The warmth came from the core, the breath came from the walls. The soul of the home was its fire, and the fire had to be cradled, not caged. One of the last cabins Thomas helped build before the railroad reached the ridge belonged to the Avery family, recent arrivals from Missouri with 3 children and a 4th on the way. Their wagon had broken an axle 2 miles from town, and they'd been sheltering under canvas for a week when Thomas found them. The youngest child had begun coughing, a hard, wet sound that deepened with the cold. Thomas didn't speak. He just walked a slow circle around their chosen plot, tested the ground with the heel of his boot, noted the sun's position, and began digging. They followed. The cabin they built was a rush job, 4 weeks from trench to roof, but Thomas taught them to pack the spaces tight with wisdom rather than speed. They sealed the floor before the walls. They lined the chimney with soapstone from the river bend. They angled the window shutters to catch morning light and deflect afternoon wind. They built a sleeping platform above the main hearth so the children could rest in the warmest air of the house. By the time the first snow dusted the ridgeline, the Avery cabin glowed from within, not brightly, not ostentatiously, but like a coal banked for the night, holding warmth through dark hours. And then, just as the leaves turned to copper and the first frost crept into the hollows, the train came, not with passengers or speeches, but with lumber, pallets of milled boards, barrels of nails, and rolled blueprints stamped with the emblem of the Northern Pacific Expansion Corps. The men who followed were all talk and orders. They hired laborers, laid out town grids, and posted signs at crossroads naming places that had never had names before. One of those signs read, Granger Junction. Thomas hadn't asked for that. He hadn't approved it. But the men with pens had decided it honored him. He found the irony bitter. Granger Junction wasn't a place of warmth. It was a depot, a supply yard. Rows of flat-pack cabins nailed together in 3 days by crews who never stayed more than a week. These houses had windows on every side, doors that faced wherever the path happened to go, and walls a single board thick with no insulation. They were bright, quick, and cheap, and they were death traps. That winter, the worst storm in 20 years rolled down from the north like a living beast. It struck just before Christmas, blanketing the valley in 4 feet of snow and dropping temperatures to 65 below in the gulches. The wind howled like a freight engine, battering walls and slamming shutters loose. Trees snapped in the forest, fences vanished under snow, and the train, bright, gleaming, and proud, froze solid on the tracks. Inside the prefab houses of Granger Junction, people lit everything they had, chairs, crates, window frames, to stay warm. Frost crawled up the inside walls, and children cried themselves hoarse before falling silent in the cold. 5 families tried to flee. 3 of them didn't make it. Thomas heard the cries before he saw the fires. He pulled on his coat, took a lantern, and began the long trudge through waist-deep snow, stopping at each house he passed. At the Averys, the windows glowed with orange light, and the door opened before he could knock. They were warm, safe. They had enough food, enough wood. He told them to stay inside. Then he moved on. At Granger Junction, he found chaos. Smoke from burning houses mixed with the blizzard's haze. Men ran with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Women clutched children close to their chest. No one knew where to go. No one knew how to fight the cold except to run from it. Thomas didn't try to fix the houses. He knew better. You couldn't fix bad design with desperation. Instead, he opened his doors, and so did the rest of the valley. By the end of that storm, 53 people had taken shelter in 9 homes, all of them built with Thomas's help. None of them froze. None of them burned. None of them died. After the thaw, the truth could no longer be ignored. The blueprints failed. The cabins built from Granger's methods stood. And that's when the engineers finally sat down and listened. It wasn't easy. Thomas wasn't a man of diagrams. He didn't speak in measurements and tolerances. He spoke in breath and earth and light. He told them to watch where snow drifted, to learn where wind bit hardest. He showed them how a chimney's shape changed a room's temperature by 10 degrees. He made them hold a stone, fresh from the fire, and feel how long the heat lasted. He made them understand heat not as a number, but as a story, a journey that moved through space, fought its way past walls, and only stayed where it was welcomed. The engineers listened. They took notes. Some sneered, others nodded, and a few understood. One of them, a young architect named Randall Clark, returned the next spring, not with orders but with curiosity. He asked to live in one of the valley's homes for a season. He helped dig post holes, haul firewood, repair roofing after storms. He watched how people lived, how they managed heat like it was a second crop to be harvested and stored. And when he left, he carried with him something rare, respect. Clark would go on to publish a pamphlet the following year titled Thermal Retention in High-Altitude Settlements, citing Thomas Granger's work extensively. It wasn't popular. It didn't win him friends in the rail offices, but the Army Corps read it, mission outposts read it, and when the government began funding outposts in the coldest reaches of the Rockies, some of them were built with Granger's principles temples baked into every beam. Thomas didn't care about the recognition. By now, his own body was showing wear. The winters hadn't broken him, but they had chipped away. His joints ached, his breath came short. He couldn't haul stone like he used to, couldn't split logs for days on end. So he trained others, not just men. He taught women how to seal a chimney base. He showed teenagers how to notch airflow into a roof beam. He knelt with children and had them press their hands against stones warmed by the sun, teaching them how to feel what insulation meant. He knew he wouldn't last forever, so he planted the knowledge everywhere he could. By the time Thomas turned 60, the valley had transformed once more. Granger Junction had grown into a true town, but not like the others, springing up along the rails. Its houses were heavier, its walls thicker. There were two kinds of homes now, those made from crates and patterns, and those made from hands and memory, and people began to notice which ones lasted, not just through winter, but through decades. And in the middle of it all stood Thomas's original cabin, now almost ceremonial, barely used except in gatherings and teaching. Inside, the hearth still burned, the stones still held warmth well into the night, and carved into one of the beams above the door, in handwriting as rough as bark, were 4 words: build to keep life. When Thomas Granger passed away in the autumn of 1853, it was not during a storm or in the grip of frost, but quietly, beneath a wool blanket by the fire he had built with his own hands. He died in the only cabin he had never rebuilt, not because it was perfect, but because it had become something else entirely, proof that survival could be taught, shaped, and passed on. The valley grieved in silence, not with fanfare, not with speeches, but with action. Dozens of families laid down their tools the next morning. Work paused across the ridgeline. Wagons stopped on the trail, and from sunup to sundown, people came. Old settlers, new arrivals, ranchers, trappers, widows, children. They came carrying stones from their land, each one placing them around Thomas's grave beside the cabin, building a low wall that would, in time, rise into a full circle, part monument, part marker, but mostly memory. There was no preacher, no hymns, no official from the rail office came. The only words spoken aloud came from Randall Clark, the architect who had once written about Thomas's designs, now grey at the temples, who stood with hat in hand and simply said, "He taught us how to keep our children warm." That was enough. But death did not silence the work. If anything, it magnified it. Thomas had prepared for the end in his quiet, methodical way. Months before his final winter, he had begun assembling a collection, a series of crude instructional tablets made of thick pine boards, each one etched with charcoal ink and beeswax to withstand weather. On them were drawings, lessons, techniques, not full blueprints, but guiding truths. He called them the warmth boards. He didn't give them to the railroad. He didn't send them east. He gave them to the valley. One board was left in the Avery cabin, another in the Cullens. A third went to a schoolhouse built with thick double walls that bore his marks on the lintels. Each board explained something different: how to position a hearth, how to chink with composite material, how to align windows for seasonal airflow. But together they told a story. Warmth is not built, it is trapped, it is guided, it is kept. The idea that warmth could be kept, as if it had memory, was the closest Thomas ever came to poetry, and that idea, more than any physical structure, became his legacy. As years passed, the valley changed again. What had been homesteads and scattershot ranches grew into neighborhoods, then a small town, then a regional waypoint with a depot and post office and general store. The name Granger eventually became more than just a junction. It became a town, but its origins were not in steel or maps. They were in cabins that held heat when no one else could. Visitors came and went. Few stayed long enough to understand, but those who did often returned in winter, hoping to find someone who still knew how to build like the old ways. And always, there was someone, because the people Thomas taught had taught others, and so it spread. One winter, a man from Wyoming Territory brought blueprints rolled tight in oilskin, asking to study the Granger homes. He was met with cautious silence until he said the right words. Not a title or credential, but this: "I've buried 2 sons to frost. I'm not here to build fast. I'm here to build right." They opened doors for him, and later those blueprints, updated and informed by the valley's lessons, were carried further still, into mining towns, mountain passes, outposts so remote their names never made it east. You could track the influence like footprints in the snow, the double-layer walls, the buried hearthstones, the chimney bends, the venting systems crafted from memory instead of textbooks. But even as the designs evolved, the core remained the same. Every cabin that kept a family alive through a night of howling wind paid tribute to one quiet man who had chosen to listen to the land instead of fight it. Over time, myths grew. People began to speak of Thomas Granger in half-truths and exaggerations, that he had learned his tricks from a mountain spirit, that he never slept, only watched the fire, that his hearth had burned continuously for 10 years. None of that was true. The truth was simpler and more powerful. He had failed once, then learned. He had listened, then taught. He had built, then rebuilt, then built again. And what he left behind wasn't just cabins. It was a way of thinking, a way of paying attention. When newcomers asked why the houses in Granger felt warmer than others built in the same conditions, the old-timers would simply say, "It's because we remember." Remember what? How to work with cold, not against it. How to trap heat like water in a barrel. How to build a wall that breathes just enough to survive. That legacy took root in ways Thomas never could have imagined. When the schoolhouse in Granger burned in 1871, the community rebuilt it using the warmth boards as guides. When influenza swept through the valley in 1880, families huddled inside homes that could maintain stable temperatures even when fires were low, saving elders, children, the vulnerable. When a sudden freeze hit a train full of settlers in 1888, it was Granger families who took in the stranded and knew exactly how to keep them alive through the worst. All of it traced back to one man who had no formal training, no schooling beyond what his father and grandfather had passed down, and no desire for recognition. Thomas Granger didn't invent a technology, he preserved an instinct. That instinct now lived on in the bones of houses, the grooves of floorboards, the angle of every chimney built from that point forward in the valley. And though winters still came, brutal and sharp and deadly, they were met not with fear, but with readiness, because Granger had taught them how to be ready. In the final years before his death, someone asked Thomas what he believed was the most important part of a cabin. The walls? The chimney? He'd shaken his head and pointed instead to the floor. "Why?" the man asked. And Thomas had said, "Because it's what touches you when you sleep. If the ground is cold, the fire's wasted. If the ground is warm, you don't need much else. Start there, build up. Simple, humble, true." That philosophy now lay beneath 1,000 beds, under thick timbers, packed earth, and the stone bones of homes that still held warmth long after the fires died down. In Granger, they still teach children how to press their palms against the floor each winter morning and feel whether the cabin is healthy. They still tell stories of a man who spoke little, built slow, and saved lives one stone at a time. And if you walk past the circle of stones, around his grave just after dawn on the coldest day of the year, you might see it, the faintest plume of breath rising from the earth, not from the dead, but from the memory they left burning.